Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
In the Matrix, you have two different orders of reality. There is a computer-generated world of artificial reality where things are normal. And outside that, there is the real world, and the real world is very nasty, dangerous, and unpleasant. I tend to think that where we are in terms of our efforts to cope with climate change and to cope with wider problems of sustainability resembles the structure of the Matrix. On the one hand, we have endless meetings, 20 years almost of endeavor, 20 years in which these negotiations have a kind of internal momentum of their own. I think one could say that for all the 17 or so meetings of the UN negotiations on climate change, the actual impact on what's happening to our world has been quite minimal, really. That is the kind of virtual world which many people I know who work in the climate change area inhabit. They talk of green growth, they talk of the green economy, they sort of pretend that we're coping with the issue. Outside, you have the real world in which we live and what is happening in that real world. There are not simply two positions on climate change. There are three positions, and there's gradations between them. There are the skeptics who think either that it isn't happening, which is more or less impossible to say now, or think it isn't produced by human agency. There is the orthodox scientific community, who are scientists. They're not just everyday observers. They spend their lives as climatologists studying these things, who argue that climate change is extremely dangerous, mainly because it produces more and more violent weather. When you say world temperature has gone up by 1.3 degrees since the turn of the 20th century, maybe more, it sounds innocuous. But if you look in the Arctic, temperature there has gone up by 3 degrees already, could go up 7 or 8 degrees, and what happens in the Arctic affects the whole of the world's climate, let alone the progression of temperature which will happen anyway. Climate change will produce turbulent weather everywhere, a mixture of drought and flooding, which at the end of the process, it will be very, very difficult to live with. The third position, that is the position of the radicals. Unlike most of the skeptics, are themselves scientists who say that the level of tolerance for temperature increase is much lower than the world community says. Overall, every year, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has gone up, and every year, as the Mauna Loa observations show, it's gone up more than the years before. Every decade it's increased more steeply than before. So there's an enormous gap between the reality of what's happening in the world and the kind of virtual reality of the negotiations that go on and the plans that are endlessly produced by states to support those negotiations. I've looked at the scientific literature directly, not just the IPCC reports for the last 5 years. The seriousness of the risk is what impresses me most. Of course, a risk which has not yet, as it were, happened, has an all-too-late quality. That's why it's a very difficult type of risk to deal with climate change. That's why people tend to wait around and not do anything, because you don't know until it's too late what is really going to happen, or at least with 100% capability, 100% certainty. We've created a world for ourselves which is no longer at the moment fully within our control. It's important to see that we live in an anthropocentric world. That is, we've essentially intervened in nature so much that nature no longer exists in many areas of our lives because it's so penetrated by human activity. And now this includes the climate. That's an awesome thing, I think. One of the things you should remember about climate change, which makes it so different from many other world problems, is that so far as we know, it's irreversible. There is no way of getting the greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere once they're there. It's an awesome prospect to suppose that we might be changing the world's climate in a radical way, in a permanent fashion, I think. What kind of legacy is that for the generation which comes after us? For all the talk of a green economy, it's important to point out that there isn't a single green economy in the world. There is not one single green economy. If you measure what a green economy should mean, which is an economy which is sufficient to deal with its own problems of sustainability and sufficient to sustain a 2% increase and no more in climate change levels, if you generalized it for a country. In saying these things, I'd like to make it clear what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing against UN-led climate change negotiations. I'm not arguing against programs which states and groups of states could develop to try to limit their carbon emissions and try to become somehow more sustainable in terms of their consumption of goods and their everyday lifestyle practice. I'm not speaking out against that. I think such negotiations must continue. What I'm saying is that we can't just assess those negotiations or anything else we do just in internal terms. We can't just live in a virtual world of endless negotiations. We must have substance. And the substance has to be introduced far, far more quickly and radically than is happening at the moment, because we've probably only got about 10, 15, 20-year gap at the most to make a really far-reaching dent in the world's dependence on fossil fuels. We're not trying to save the planet, by the way. We're not. The planet will be fine. We're trying to create decent conditions for a world in which you have a global industrial civilization heavily dependent on fossil fuels, so that that global civilization can be sustainable and can survive at the outer limit. That's what we're trying to do. So what should we do if we're looking for substance rather than just form? First, I think on an international level, we're going to have to look for bilateral and regional agreements, not just universal, legally binding ones. What is happening behind the scenes is just as important as what's happening in the formal negotiations, which is states getting together with one another and trying to introduce real practical innovations. I feel that although in the past it's been the industrial countries that have tried to take the lead in reducing carbon emissions and improving sustainability, we're entering a situation where the large developing countries are likely to take much more of a leadership role than the industrial countries do. And I mean by this China and Brazil particularly. Second, I think all over the place we have to look for groundbreaking initiatives. I think we're desperately in need of breakthroughs of one or another kind. These could be technological breakthroughs, they could be breakthroughs in action by a cluster of states. I list several things in the book. Without breakthroughs, it's really hard to see how we're ever going to close the gap in time, I think. So we have to invest in trying to secure them. Third, I think we need a lot of intellectual and policy work. I invite the RSA to contribute to this. We don't have a clue what a green economy is at the moment. It's just an empty phrase. A green economy is not just going to be like our economy now with a lot of renewables thrown into it. It's going to have a different structure. It's going to have a different form and have implications for employment, for welfare, even perhaps for gender relations, for all the traditional areas in which an economy impacts on our lives. We're talking about a sort of totalizing change over 20 or 30 years. We've got to do a lot more intellectual work on that. If we have a period of, say, 4 or 5 years of growth of 1%, it's an invitation to us to look at the nature of growth. I think it's an invitation, especially in a European context, to look at the nature of growth and see how we might produce greater prosperity without it being simply formally indexed by GDP. Finally, fourthly, I think what we're talking about here is a long-term transformation, essentially, in the way in which we live, which has to be a global transformation, and which is itself a very challenging intellectual and policy-making task. But we're really talking, I think, of an overall transformation of the way in which we live, because industrial society has kind of run its course, or in the way in which it was structured for 150 years, it's run its course, I think. So I'm arguing politically for, of course, nations doing things on the ground. We need an element of utopianism because we have to think beyond the world in which we live at the moment, I think. We have to find at the same time a better way of life, if we can, I think, as part of that project. We do need some kind of message of hope. We do need some kind of message of what a better world could be, not just a message of despair. Therefore, in conclusion, I'm neither a pessimist or an optimist. All I ask is that people in the world accept that the risks are very, very real, and we must find a way of dealing with risks which no other civilization has ever had to confront.
It feels as though governments in the past were much better at thinking long-term, about investing in infrastructure. You know, look at our great cities and the leaders who would invest for 20 or 30 years in sewerage. They would invest in things which they would never get the credit for, but they had a vision of a better society.
I think of
the
people
prevailing
built
view,
cathedrals then.
exactly. The prevailing view now is that our politicians globally are incapable of such kind. Now, why is it? Do you think that's true? And if it is true, what is it that's gone wrong that we have so little faith now in our political
It's a good question.
masters?
I think part of the reason for short-termism is actually the dominance, if you want to call it that, of a neoliberal view of the world of the past 30 or so years, where you simply don't get enough of a framework of planning. And if you look at the energy industries, for example, that have been radically privatized, some have done well, but they've also experienced all sorts of problems, especially in investment. Haven't really invested in this country, now faces big problems for its energy structure for the future because of the lack of investment following privatization. So I argue we do need a sort of return to planning, but it can't be 1950s style planning, which was a failure. I mean, it's not just climate change, it's simple energy. You know, if you're going to cope with your energy needs, you've got to have at least a 20-year cycle. We've been living a short-termist type civilization, I think, because of the dominance of markets, really. And I don't know, I think there, you know, whatever I'm not against markets, but do we really want to be in a living world which is sort of run by financial markets? What the hell are financial markets? They seem to be something we've created outside of our own control as well. Why should the world be run in that way? I'm not at all sure it should. So I think it needs some kind of return to an active confrontation with the future, and it needs to be geared in a real political way in the context of what governments can actually do.
Are you disappointed or concerned about the way in which, broadly speaking, and maybe this is a generalization across the world, it feels as though green issues are seen to be associated with a progressive left-of-center mindset, and that the right tends to be antagonistic and more likely to be skeptical? Is that a natural process, or is it a political accident? And how problematic is it in terms of winning public support for action?
Climate change is not a left-right issue intrinsically. I don't see what it's got to do with left or right. It has left-right tinge because you have the issue of, for example, how the poorer countries in the world are going to manage without being submerged literally, the low-lying ones. But I don't see it as a left-right issue. Therefore, in every country where we can build a political consensus, we should do. And until very recently, we had pretty substantial political consensus in this country. I think the coalition more or less accepted the framework which Labour had set up. Of course, it's all a matrix-type world because we've got all this framework, but we haven't got any bloody renewable energy. We're right at the bottom of the European League. It's all, at the moment, a virtual world. But the big cases of difficulty in the world, I think, are the three that I mentioned: the heavy energy economies geared to cheap energy and cheap credit, especially the United States. And I think it's a disaster in the US, really, the polarization around climate change. You virtually cannot be a Republican and believe that climate change is real and produced by human activity. You've got a totally polarized society there, in the one society which needs to change most, because the US uses it's got 4% of the world's population, uses 25% of the world's energy every year, and creates about 22% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's a sort of disastrous situation. So on the whole, I'm against a left-right polarization.
Do you think, Tony, just to finish on this, are people like Tim Jackson part of the problem in the sense that Tim links his arguments about sustainability to a deeper critique of consumer capitalism? And I think there is an argument that says, actually, if the argument around climate change was stripped down of those kinds of arguments and was simply an argument about insurance, which simply said, look, this thing seems to be quite likely, People insure their houses and they insure their cars, even though they don't think the house is going to burn down or they're going to have a car accident, because they think it's well worth doing as a risk. If countries invested as much...
They're pooling risk, actually.
Yeah, if countries invested as much in insuring themselves against climate change as families do against, fires and car accidents, we'd be fine. That would be quite a high proportion of our income. So do you think there's a danger that people like Jackson, who bring together green arguments with a deeper critique of the modern world, actually reinforce this idea that you've got to be a bit of a lefty to be a climate change enthusiast, to want to act on climate change?
No, I don't think so, actually. I mean, I don't even like the term green. I sort of call myself an ungreen green because I don't really believe in the business that we're saving trees for the sake of trees or anything like that. I'm in favour of science and technology and things that the Greens, some Greens anyway, until recently, being suspicious of. So I don't even know that terminology. But I think, as you actually at the moment got a left and right critique of consumer capitalism, I think. I mean, the right never used to believe in the virtues of a free market. I think the trouble with conservatism came when conservatives started to believe in free markets as a solution to everything, which was not what conservatism was ever about. Conservatives were more critical of the free market originally than left of centre.